There is nothing natural about saying that this is my part of the world and no one else can come in here. This is something that has been produced through the 20th century. I don't think that it makes sense in the abstract to say that we should be pro-migration or anti-migration, right? Migration as a political question is always, to me, context dependent. I don't think Palestinians should be asked to have open borders to settlers. But in a world where capital is free to move across borders without restriction, and goods are free to move across borders without restriction, you can't also say that plausibly, inconsistently, and without hypocrisy, that Labour cannot move across borders without restriction. To me, it comes down to the question of the relationship between capital and labour. If you want to imagine a hypothetical world, completely different world from the one we're in which capital is constrained to particular parts of the world, goods are constrained, then sure, we can have the conversation about also constraining migration in those ways. That's a million miles away from the world we're in. There is nothing natural about saying that this is my part of the world and no one else can come in here. This is something that has been produced through the 20th century, right? Like passports were only invented around 1900. In Britain, until the 1960s, anywhere that you lived within the British Empire, which included half the world, large parts of Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, anyone from those parts of the British Empire more or less was free to move to Britain without any restriction. So there's nothing natural about saying, oh no, we have to restrict movement. That started to really happen in the 1970s, is when we really started to say, no, we want these infrastructures of bordering that become very violent over the following decades up to the present day, that result in the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. Europe has caused the death of 40,000 at least, mainly by drowning in the Mediterranean, right? Because we make it impossible for people to come into Europe. We're willing to shoot people who are trying to come into Europe. A few years ago, you had the people being shot at as they were trying to come from Morocco into Spain. The shooting was praised by even our socialist friends, the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. This is a product of a particular system that's been built since the 1970s that's bound up with what has also happened since the 1970s, which is the neoliberal globalization of capital, right? So the two go hand in hand. You want freedom of movement of capital, and you want to use violence to stop the freedom of movement of labour. Why? Because if you allow labour to move more freely, then it undermines your ability to have a racial differentiation in the wages that you pay on both sides of that border. You can pay someone 1/5 of the wage in Mexico compared to what they'd be paid on the other side of the border in the United States. So that enables you for capitalists to go across the border, outsource production, and save their labour costs and have greater profits, right? That's what borders are doing. That's what ultimately borders are doing. And creating a undocumented workforce within the United States that can also be more heavily exploited because it's more heavily policed, because it's racially segregated from the rest of the working class of the United States, right? Racism becomes profitable to capitalism. Borders is a part of that. That is how we need to understand the politics of borders, and that is why abolishing that border between the United States and Mexico is an anti-racist proposal and a pro-working class proposal for working classes on both sides of the border, and an anti-capitalist proposal. And we need to understand that that segregation of working classes that borders carries out is as violent and as racist as Jim Crow segregation or apartheid South Africa. It results in as much violence. Like in 2021, so this is not a Trump policy, but a Biden policy. In 2021, 1 million people were expelled from the United States. 1 million people, mainly Mexicans. That's ethnic cleansing on a huge scale. And the point of it is to maintain profits for capitalists. So this is what we need to confront, I think, more than anything, because when you have that level of violence at the border, you can no longer talk about liberal democracy on your side of the border, right? Europe can't say, we are a civilization based on liberal values and tolerance, and we are the home of liberal democracy, if on its periphery, it's shooting people and killing people simply because they want to cross a border. Eventually that violence comes home again into the core of Europe, and That's exactly what the far right are doing. The far right are saying, no, we're not a tolerant Europe. We don't want to be a tolerant Europe. We don't want to be a liberal Europe. Let's stop the hypocrisy and the contradictions between what we say and what we do. Let's just admit that we are trying to exclude people and that we want to create a white Christian Europe. That's a powerful argument because it builds on the hypocrisy of liberal Europe. Right? It exploits that hypocrisy. So from our point of view, we need to expose that hypocrisy from the other side and say, yes, let's talk about what a liberal Europe would really look like. And it's one in which you don't have this level of border violence and this level of murder of people whose only crime is to want to cross a border.